Hey, psych students, welcome to chapter 2, the brain and behavior. I cannot tell you how many times I've recorded this. Um, and it's just because I go back and I look at it and I'm like, wow, this has been kind of dry to get through. So I'm going to try really hard to make this as interesting as possible. So what I'll do is I will skip through things just like I do in other presentations that are, that can be lead you down the road of like, when is this going to end? And that's the reason I put links and just interesting little facts in my presentation. So this is a heavily termed chapter, really focusing on the biology and the body and how it relates to psychology. So you see just all the parts and it can be a little daunting. So I'm just going to try to skim through the things. And like I always say, if you're really interested in the brain and how the biology affects the psychology, which is very important because the biggest debate in psychology is the nature nurture debate, then I would suggest taking an entire semester on this. It is generally called developmental psychology, and they go much more deeper into the brain, the body, and how everything affects everything. But in this chapter, I'm just going to kind of skim through it and give you, some highlights. But of course, you can start with study hall. That's a really good one. It's a more updated one, like I say in the other things. And then Crash Course is a great synopsis of the brain and behavior. They do a really good job of just shortening that up in like 10 to 12 minutes. So the both of those are very good to watch. All right, so as you can see, what I'm going to break down: the nervous system, neurons, brain structures and functions, endocrine system, brain damage, plasticity and repair, and genetics and behavior. And when we see a lot of pictures and a lot of stuff, I'm just going to say, hey, you could stop, you could pause, you could look at this, you can, if you're a student of mine and you're not just looking at this for fun out there in the internet world, then you can look in your textbook and do more of a deep dive. All right. So again, when we're looking at the nervous system, we're looking at its complexity, we're looking at integration of, systems of within, we're looking at adaptability, specifically plasticity, and how that really does help within our system, and then electrochemical transmission. Now, I'm not going to go through all of that. All right, so again, this is just looking at and asking the questions: which type connects with the skin, which type connects with muscle, and I will break that down. So afferent is the pathway carrying information towards the brain or specific organ, while the efferent is the pathway carrying information away from that point. So, when we have all of this external stuff going on, we've got these words, right? And or these pathways, I should say. And at every single moment that we are talking and thinking, we've got these neural, like, just spaghetti things all over the place that are carrying things to, carrying things away. Our brain is just a constant flow of information. So if you want to think about it in this way, I wrote afferent is arriving, AA, and efferent is exiting, EE. All right. All right, so just some breakdown of your nervous system. You've got your central nervous system, that's the brain and spinal cord. Those are the two main components there. And then in your peripheral nervous system, you have under that, it's like the umbrella. You've got the somatic nervous system. You've got your sensory nerves and your motor nerves linked to muscular activity. Internal organs, and then you've got your autonomic nervous system, and within that, that's the umbrella. You've got your sympathetic nervous system, which arouses, and your parasympathetic nervous system that calms. So you've got half of your body is that arousal state, and the other half of your body is the calming state. So it's really interesting when you just look at it in general and overall when you think of your life, that kind of yin yang. You need both sides to work with each other, and that's what our body does, and that's what our systems do. The left side of your brain controls the right, and the right controls the left. Without it, if there's a disconnect, then that other side of your body is affected. This is just a picture you can pause, you can look at, just to show you all the various areas in your central nervous system, looking at your brain. And then in your peripheral nervous system, looking at the somatic and your autonomic nervous system. All right, in the nervous system, you have a bazillion D, I say bazillion D, but it's 100 billion neurons in the brain. It's so complex to even talk about in a general psychology class. So just note that all of these cells are responsible for processing information. Your brain is like a computer system. It really is. It's in human form. All right, again, another picture for you to look at. This is the structure of the neurons. These are dendrites. They're like the branchy like systems. So you've got your cell body, the dendrites, which are the little branchy things. You've got your axon. This is kind of the connection of both. And then the myelin sheath is what is under that is the yellow, what are the Mike and Ike's, look like the little bean things. All right, again, some more just picture to show you what the neural impulse looks like. More fun pictures for you to look at. Again, not going into this, but you can always pause, look in your text. Again, if you're a visual, I'm very visual. So if you say it to me, I'm like, I don't understand. Show me something. Let me see, what is going on in my brain. Even though, I see it biologically, I could see the mechanisms of what's happening. Unless you are fascinated with this type of stuff, um, you're not. So it's, again, if you decide, like, I really like this, I'm into this, what is a really good career for someone that takes like developmental psychology, any of that, is obviously researchers, and then people that want to work in the neuropsychology field, maybe working with people that have had brain injury, trauma, accidents, working with Alzheimer's patients. So you would heavily focus on this biological aspect. So every single, chapter has its worth and its place in psychology because, again, everything biological is simultaneously psychological. So these are just those heavily termed words that you would learn in going in the biological sciences route. All right, so what I will break down more are the neurotransmitters. Okay, so one of the neurotransmitters is acetylcholine. And what that neurotransmitter is responsible for are your muscle actions, learning, and memory. And what you will find are that various neurotransmitters are responsible for, many of the same things. Like they cross over. They're not just responsible for one thing, but you might find that another neurotransmitter is also responsible for learning and memory. All right, so black widow venom, you can learn about that in your text. But basically, with that, there's high levels of acetylcholine. When you have high levels, there's the black widow venom. When you have low levels of acetylcholine, that is associated with Alzheimer's disease. All right, the next neurotransmitter we're going to talk about, or I'm just going to touch on, is GABA. And what GABA does, refines precision by inhibiting firing. So, if you have anxiety, then that means you have low levels of GABA. And that can all be, found under scans, different kinds of scans and blood tests. All right, the next one is glutamate, and that is excitatory, and that is responsible for learning and memory as well. It's also involved in many psychological disorders. So whether there is a lack of or an increase of is the various, disorders. Norepinephrine, if you've got high levels of norepinephrine, that's linked to stress and mania. If you have lower levels of norepinephrine, then that is linked to depression. So again, our neurotransmitters are, they're either balanced or they're maybe a little elevated or they're a little declined. And sometimes, whatever the case is, that's where medications can really help kind of balance those neurotransmitters. And I'll talk about that more when we get into like serotonin and dopamine. All right, so norepinephrine regulates sleep states in conjunction with acetylcholine. So you notice that acetylcholine also was affected in sleep. Sorry, got all mumbled jumbled in my words. All right, dopamine is the next neurotransmitter, and that is responsible for your voluntary movement. Also, reward anticipation. You hear a lot about dopamine, your natural dopamine, like releasing when you see something like that hamburger. Like if you're not a vegan or vegetarian, you might look at the burger and you're like, oh my God, that looks so good. That is your dopamine working. That's saying like, I want to go and get myself Shake Shack, or, I mean, that's not here, but wherever it is that you like your burgers. So that's that anticipation of reward. Where it can be affected is with stimulant drugs. So that activates dopamine receptors. And what happens is if people become addicted to, specific drugs, it messes with the natural dopamine. And so therefore people, take more of the drug to get that dopamine rush or that level. But it messes with the natural dopamine that you have. All right, so what we see is that low levels of dopamine are linked to Parkinson's disease, and high levels of dopamine are linked to schizophrenia. Right, serotonin, regulation of sleep, mood, attention, and learning. So you can already see that different neurotransmitters you're seeing repetitively with certain, areas like sleep. Serotonin is also involved in that. So if you have low levels, the biggest thing, low levels of serotonin is linked with depression. And so one of the psychotherapeutic drugs is Prozac. It's the oldest, depression medication. It's now used for many other things. And it's really cool because through research, we are seeing that in lower doses of certain medications, they work for other things other than depression. So Prozac does work for other things other than depression. So if you have a doctor that has prescribed you that, it's fluoxetine, they might be prescribing it for something that's not depression. And if it's not, and you're not depressed, well, then it won't work for that, right? Because you're not depressed. It'll work for what it's intended to. That's the cool thing that I like learning about with neurotransmitters and medications, is that through research, they find that, hey, wait, this med also works for this. So what it does is it increases the serotonin levels to kind of give you that balance again. All right, your endorphins are natural opiates. So those are, again, things that we naturally have within our body, and they mediate feelings of pleasure and pain. And when your natural endorphins kick in, like when you jog or you run, you're releasing endorphins, and it gives you like that natural high, that natural good feeling. All right, so each neurotransmitter has specific pathways. So when we look at this graph of serotonin, Oh, sorry. Let me go back. This is kind of what is happening. These are the pathways in your brain for that neurotransmitter. All right, oxytocin, if you've ever heard of that, that is a hormone and a neurotransmitter. It's related to onset of lactation in new mothers. It's related to attachment and emotional bonds, and it may have a role in responding to stress. So oxytocin is like when you hug someone, right? When you feel that really good feeling about someone, oxytocin is being released. That's that like that feel good, that love hormone. All right, neurotransmitters and drugs. So you can stop, pause, and look at this. This is interesting. It shows you all the regions of the brain. So your frontal lobe, your occipital lobe, your parietal lobe, and your temporal lobe. And this just shows you in what areas these neurotransmitters kind of work. And then also looking at substance use. All right, so drugs, again, can interfere with the neurotransmitters. They act as agonists, so they initiate a physiological response or mimic or increase neurotransmitter effects. And then you have your antagonists. Those bind to the receptor to prevent a response. So it blocks the effects of the neurotransmitters. Again, another just kind of picture for you to look at. One way to study the brain is through brain lesioning, so naturally occurring or induced, and then also through an EEG. There are many different kinds of scans. A brain scan or an EEG does an electrical recording of the brain. It's really great in sleep studies. So it can show like when you're in your sleep state, when you're in your REM state, or dreaming state, and it can show a lot of like abnormalities, especially if you're suffering with like nightmare disorder or nightmare or narcolepsy or any of those types of sleep wake disorders. All right, so let me go back. All right, so looking at brain imaging, because there's a lot of ways to look at your brain, and looking at your live brain. So this is what an X-ray would look like. This is what a CAT or CT scan looks like. And kind of as you go more, they get more expensive. So, usually they serve different purposes. X-rays look at like bones and broken things and, whatever. CAT scans look more like internally. And, well, I'll touch on that. Like PET scan, it has like a deeper level because there's contrast involved. They get a little more what's the word I'm looking for, kind of invasive. So there's more chance of, because there's radioactivity, there's different things. So they're very careful when to say, okay, we're not going to overuse a PET scan, but if they notice something like deeper that the others won't bring up, that's when they'll use like a PET scan. You've got your MRI, and then you've got your fMRI. And the difference with that, as you can see, is the fMRI is looking at blood flow. So it's looking at the flow of the blood in the brain. All right, then TMS, we don't really talk about that. Okay, so this again, great pictures, great kind of visualization of the forebrain, everything that's within that. And I'm going to break it down a little bit. So you've got your forebrain, you've got your midbrain, you've got your hindbrain. That's kind of the oldest part, well, the cerebellum. So we break that down further. That's your brainstem. You need that to survive. The medulla or medulla oblongata, that controls breathing and regulates reflexes. So, damage to the medulla, to the brainstem, could lead to death, coma, any of that. So, again, it doesn't necessarily will happen, but depends on the damage. The pons is responsible for sleep and arousal. So again, we looked at neurotransmitters, but then there's other areas in the brain that also are a part of that system. So again, we look at pons specifically, and that is for sleep and arousal. Your cerebellum is also known as the little brain, the oldest part. and that is for motor coordination, social thinking, and behavior. Your midbrain, that is where your reticular formation is at. So that is the stereotyped behavior pattern, like walking. Without that, like you cease to walk. All right, looking at your limbic system, that is a whole system. Within that system, there are parts. So again, it's like this umbrella term, and then there are all these things that are in that system. So the limbic system as a whole is responsible for memory and emotion. Within that system is the amygdala. It's the two little almond shaped pieces. And those are the things like that are responsible, like your fear, excitement, all of the anger. That's your amygdala working. So that's the discrimination of objects needed for survival. That is what, it does its job. So if you're afraid and you run, your amygdala is working. Emotional awareness and expression. So again, fear response, emotions, all of that stuff, the amygdala is responsible. The hippocampus, that's responsible for like your long term declarative memories, which, they all get compartmentalized in your sleep. So that's the formation and consolidation of memory. So again, when you go to sleep, your hippocampus is working to store all the memories from the day. Your thalamus is the relay station for much of your sensory information. So all the sensory stuff, that is your thalamus working. The basal ganglia is coordination of voluntary movements. Your hypothalamus is responsible for your eating, drinking, and sexual behaviors. So if all of those in the brain are in check, those things are regulated. Also your internal state, so temperature, that's controlled by the hypothalamus, as well as emotion, reward, or emotion, stress, and reward. So you can see all of these pieces, they all kind of connect together, and some are responsible for multiple things, not just, one thing. All right, these are just looking at differences in the brain all the way from a rat to a human. All right, now let's look at your four lobes of your brain, because those are obviously interesting too, and those are within that system. So within your cerebral cortex, you have your four lobes. And again, and in that you've got that limbic system. So that's your outermost layer. You've got your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, your occipital lobe, and your temporal lobe. And I will break down what each one is responsible for. So occipital, you think of the ox, that's the eyes. So your occipital lobe is responsible for visual processing. Your temporal lobe is responsible for hearing, language processing, and memory. And like the hippocampus, those areas, hippocampus, amygdala, things like that, are housed in your temporal lobe. Your frontal lobe, that is right up front, that is your executive decision making, intelligence, personality, voluntary muscles, and planning. All of your planning ability happens because of your frontal lobe. And then your parietal lobe, that is your spatial location, attention, ability to attend, be attentive, and motor control. So again, if those areas of your brain are damaged, and again, that's what biopsychologists or neurodevelopmental psychologists study, are the lobes of the brain. So again, this chapter serves a very great purpose. It's just, it can be a little dry explaining it. All right, so this is your somatosensory cortex and motor cortex. You can pause, you can take a look at this and see what the motor cortex is responsible for, and then of course the somatosensory cortex. See how this is just it's a lot of information. All right, so your somatosensory is housed in your parietal lobe for body sensation and touch. The motor cortex is housed in your frontal lobe. Those are your voluntary movements. And then you have what's the association area. That's basically 75% of your cortex. So that's a huge part of that. So it's not sensory or motor, but it is responsible for integration of information and for executive function. So basically it's associating everything together. All right, I have included a video for you when we talk about Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Yes, I said Wernicke. It is German, so the W is pronounced V. So Broca's area is linked to speech production, and Wernicke's area is the comprehension of written and spoken language. And this is a really short but great example of what happens if Broca's or Wernicke's area is damaged. So click on that link and it'll show you. All right, this is your corpus callosum, large bundle of axons that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. This was a very interesting case study. It studied through, especially in developmental psychology, it studied the case of WJ. So you can click on this link and it will go through that specific case and what happened with the split brain research that they did with that patient. All right, so these are just, again, this is the left working with the right working with the left. All right, looking at the hemispheres. So the left hemisphere is responsible for your verbal processing, speech, and grammar. The right side of your hemisphere is the nonverbal information and your spatial perception, visual recognition, and emotions. And again, if one side is damaged, it does affect the other side. All right, now we're looking at the endocrine system, a whole other system within your brain and your body. So those are the set of glands that regulate the body by secreting hormones into the bloodstream. So the glands are pituitary, your thyroid, your parathyroid, pancreas, adrenal, ovaries, and testes. All right, and when they secrete that hormone, they're sending these chemical messages. They're relatively slow communication system, interconnected with the nervous system. All right, so your adrenal glands, those regulate mood, energy, coping with stress. And then, of course, that's also linked to epinephrine and norepinephrine. If you're looking at your pancreas, that is your digestive and endocrine functions. Hormones, including insulin, that is all run by the pancreas. Your ovaries and your testes, those are your hormones involved in sexual development and reproduction. All right, this just discusses brain damage, plasticity, and repair. You could take a look at this. There's a more of a deep dive in your textbook. Looking at brain damage and plasticity in relation to a concussion. So there's a lot of talk about concussions, especially nowadays with sports, football, and soccer. Soccer actually has a higher rate of traumatic brain injury than football does, but it doesn't matter. It's still a brain injury or mild brain injury, just depending on the situation. So that's head injury with temporary loss of brain function. And there are things that can be done to help with this with MTBI, such as brain tissue implants and brain under that following brain grafts and stem cells. All right, more again, looking at genetics and behavior, kind of what's responsible for that. You've got, again, this dives even deeper into your chromosomes, your genes, your DNA, all of the biological components. This is just a little information. If one gene of a pair is dominant and one is recessive, the dominant gene is going to override. A recessive gene exerts its influence only if both genes of a pair are recessive. So again, that's the example they give in the text is blue eyes. I'm just going to skip through this one and that's it. I knew that was going to be that. So, okay, I kept it under 30 minutes. Very glad about that. I feel better about this one than the last one that I recorded because I looked at it, I felt like I was just kind of trying to get through the motions because I operate differently, more on that psychological standpoint. So if I'm not satisfied with it, I have to redo it. So hopefully that was painless and you got something out of it. Again, in lectures, I will be putting in extra credit. This wasn't one of them, but I will. So maybe it's the next one. Woo, peace.